So today's program kicks off our Political Scientist in Residence program with Professor Alexandra Filindra. During the 2024 election cycle, we're going to learn or refresh our knowledge about the election process with Dr. Filindra. She is an associate professor of political science at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And we're looking forward to discussing civics during the course of the year through we're going to learn about, we're going to have lectures and reading recommendations and library displays so that everyone who's eligible to vote can really fully engage in the election process. Alexandra holds a PhD in political science from Rutgers University and served as a postdoctoral researcher at Brown University's Taubman Center for Public Policy and American Institutions and the Center for the Study of Human Development. So now I'm going to turn things over, and we're just really pleased to have you here with us today. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for being here. This is going to be quite an exciting election year, not quite the typical election year that we've had for a variety of reasons, and I'm happy to field questions about the differences from earlier elections compared to this one and what's happening. But first, I will start with some of the questions that the library asked me to cover, which includes sort of the structure of elections in the United States. What are primaries? What's the difference between caucuses and primaries? Why people do it one way or another? So focus on that, and then I'll be happy to have you ask me questions for each topic, and then move to another topic or entertain additional questions from you. My area of research is public opinion. I'm a survey researcher. So if you have questions about polling and what the polls show and can we trust the polls, I can address those as well. So what is a primary and what's a caucus and why we have a system in the US where we have both? Basically, each state determines their election systems. The Constitution does not give the federal government authority over election administration. So election administration is in the purview of state authority, and each state determines its own elections. When it comes to the primaries, it is actually each party, because each party is, in a sense, a private-public organization. They make choices about when, where, and how their elections are to be taking place and how they should look, what they should look like. So a primary is what we have in Illinois, and it is an actual election. It's usually held, depending on which state we're talking about, between 3 and 9 months before, 6 and 9 months before the general election. It's people show up the same way that they show up at the general election. They get a ballot with everybody's names on it, and they vote. It's typically held on a weekday. It's open from 7 a.m. until 7 p.m. or 8 p.m., like for over 12 hours, depending on the state, but basically for a long time. Basically, people actually just show up and vote. It takes like 10 minutes, typically. Depending on the state, again, in a primary, you may have only partisans vote, people who are registered for the party. Like it could be that in a state, only Republicans vote in the Republican primary. You have to be registered, or only Democrats. And other states allow independents, unaffiliated voters, to vote in one or the other primary, but you can't vote in both. If you're an independent, you choose and you go and vote in that primary. There are rules, depending on the state, where you can change your partisan affiliation before the election. Like in New Hampshire, for example, unaffiliated voters, or anyone really, has the right by October to change their affiliation and then go and vote for that party. So by October 31st, if I decided that I want to change my affiliation from Democrat to Republican, I do it and I go vote in January in the Republican primary. So what we see in primary elections is generally very low participation because it's only those people who are very interested in politics who actually show up for partisan primary elections. And participation, depending on whether it's a midterm year or a presidential year, it ranges between 10 and 25% of the electorate. So what does that mean? It means that it's only those people who are very, very committed, who are following the news, who are strong partisans, who have like beloved preferred candidates, who want to make, to really, really have something to, like, are committed to the cause that are going to show up. Which means that primary elections overall attract not the mainstream voter, but the people who are at the extremes of each party. It's very, very partisan Democrats and very, very partisan Republicans who show up to vote in party elections, in primary elections. And that means that the candidates, especially the way we have set up the system today, because the parties have become more democratic internally, especially the Republican Party. It used to be that the primary election, the outcome of the primary, produced a certain number of delegates, but that number was weighted down by what the Democrats call super delegates, party delegates. So institutional delegates from within the party. Or that basically the party would take into account the results of the primary, but basically have another mechanism that produced the preferred candidate. The Republican Party back in 2016, essentially, a little bit earlier, changed its rules and became a lot more internally democratic. So they don't have superdelegates the way that the Democrats have superdelegates, which means that the public vote from the primary is what determines the outcome of the election for the party. In the Democrats, it's a little different when you have competitive years because they have superdelegates that they're the party institutional members, the elites of the party, the elected officials of the party, the leaders of the party that have a separate vote, that they're delegates in the convention that are separate from the delegates that are chosen from the primaries. And that the party can put more weight in favor of its candidate rather than the candidate that the people chose. And we saw that in 2016 in the primary between Hillary and Bernie Sanders voters, and also the same thing, even more so in, actually, it didn't even come to that in 2020 because the party had a clear favorite in Hillary. So it was clear that they were going to push their party delegates, the super delegates, regardless of the outcomes of the primaries, the super delegates were going to go for Hillary. So what about these caucuses? Where do they come from and why we have these caucuses? A caucus is actually a meeting of members of the party, and it's held at different levels of government. So it's held at the county level or at the district level or at the precinct level, depending on the state organizing it, they're different places. And the partisan voters, this is the registered voters, come together in a room like this, actually much bigger, and basically they have a discussion and they have a debate and they separate out in candidate supporting groups. And basically it's more like party meets voting. It's actually a tradition that dates back to the 19th century. And even further back, if you think about the New England town hall model, where citizens got together and discussed problems of the town and made decisions. It's a very old democratic, with a small d, not the party, tradition, where people participate in the democratic process more intensely. And this tradition is kept alive in places like Iowa and Nevada and Wyoming and some smaller places. The concern with the caucuses and why many states have switched over time from caucuses to primaries is that primaries give a lot more people the opportunity to participate, because not many people can basically dedicate an entire evening. This thing starts at 5, 6 p.m. and it can go until 2 a.m. To politics. So it's very die-hard partisans who participate in these, very small numbers, and you can see the difference. I think that, you know, in caucuses generally, you see a lot lower numbers as a proportion of the total electorate than you see in primaries, because, you know, in my, and here in Chicago, my voting precinct is in my building because I live in a high rise. So I literally I'm in my pajamas, I go vote, and it takes me 5 minutes. The thing with the caucus, I have a 5-year-old son. What am I going to do with him if I have to go caucus for the entire day? It's very difficult. So it tends to attract demographics that are not representative of the full demographics of the party. It's older people, retired people, people who don't have children, who can go and do this and basically participate in a political party experience. It's very democratic in its roots because it involves active discussion. It's really develops civic skills, and it's, in that sense, a very good thing, but it is very exclusionary because in a modern society, a lot of people can't do it. And in Iowa, I believe, and in a couple of other places, in Nevada, activists have suggested that to do a virtual, basically town hall, a virtual caucus. But due to security concerns, the Republican Party said no to that, so it was nixed. If that's an avenue, maybe that would create a little bit more inclusiveness if they figure out a way to make it secure. It could increase the number of people who participate and thus make it more diverse and more inclusive, and people who normally wouldn't participate in this type of activity because of time constraints would show up and participate. In terms of what's happening this year, the Republican Party has a competitive election. There are, well, at least today we have 2 candidates actively, right? Last week it was 3, but yeah. There are at least 2 candidates right now. There were many more earlier going into Iowa and New Hampshire. So they have been more active. The Democratic Party, because they have a president, they have President Biden, they actually technically don't have to have primaries or the caucuses. They're sort of more coronation and sort of just, you know, a validation of their main candidate, but they're not competitive. And obviously the Democratic Party wants to stay away from any kind of competitive election at the primary level, because that would weaken its presidential candidate. Having somebody who just shows up and says, I'm going to challenge Biden in New Hampshire or wherever is problematic for the party, because it would mean that that Biden doesn't have control of the party institutionally. So they don't want to do that. They have also changed the schedule. They got into a big tiff with New Hampshire, actually, because New Hampshire typically is the first primary in the nation. And the Democratic Party, the National Party, told them, we want South Carolina to be the first in the nation. And New Hampshire wouldn't have it. So the party, the National Party said, well, we won't count your delegates officially. New Hampshire's not happy about it at all, but the party decides what the party wants to do. The rationale for this is that South Carolina's electorate is very, very different than the New Hampshire electorate. It's 50% African American for the Democrats. So because Biden desperately needs very high turnout among African Americans, and we can talk about why we are seeing a little bit of weakening on the Democratic base among people of color, especially Latinos, but also African Americans, and we're seeing it even in Chicago. The party thought that by moving the start of the campaign to South Carolina and prioritizing, putting to the agenda, at the top of the agenda, issues that affect people of color, that would create more enthusiasm and increase participation among the key voters that the key voting groups that the party really wants. On the Republican side, apparently Hawaii was supposed to have a primary or a caucus, but they have decided to cancel it and dedicate their votes to Trump. Their delegates are going to Trump already. It's interesting how the different parties and different states are dealing with this. When it comes to primaries and caucuses, as I said earlier, you can have open or closed institutional elections. So an open primary is where unaffiliated voters can participate, and a closed one is you have to have a card. You have to be a card carrying member of the party in order to participate in the vote. There are also variations to this. There are semi-open or semi-closed primaries where you're allowed to change under certain circumstances, or you bring in your affiliation, or they are flexible generally. A lot of the states try to be flexible on these issues. Why Iowa? Iowa is this big. It is this flat and has corn, right? Then they are our neighbors, so we should be nice to them. But it's Iowa. So it has a very big symbolic role in the process because it is first, and they're maintaining their first in the nation status. Like there's a huge fight every time about who's going to go first. And at some point, either in 16 or even earlier, there was a big fight because somebody else wanted to go like January 3rd. And Iowa basically said, we'll have our primary in December. And it's like, wait a minute, like, when is this election season going to start and end? This is crazy. So the party like forced whoever was the other state to back down, and Iowa is Iowa. And materially, it has very few delegates. It's not that. It's just that it creates expectations. The media descends there. All the candidates go there. There's a big parties and big meetings, and they insist on face-to-face participation, which is something that in our state is harder to do because we're so much bigger population-wise, or a place like California. Like, you can't really expect candidates to go up and down California and actually meet with people intensively. The Iowa thing started actually with Jimmy Carter, because in 1976, Jimmy Carter actually won the Iowa primary and the Iowa caucus, and it was unexpected that he was going to win. I believe his opponent in the primary was Ted Kennedy in 1976, and somebody may remember better than I do. Was either in 80 or in 76 that Kennedy was running. I don't remember. But Carter won the Iowa caucus, and that propelled him, from a little-known Georgia peanut farmer turned governor to the White House. And more recently, Iowa had a really important role to play in 2008, where Barack Obama beat Hillary Clinton in Iowa. And that set him up for the follow-up. Like, the media attention was such that people started noticing. Even though he did not win the New Hampshire primary, he still secured the nomination in 2008. So since Carter, since 1976, Iowa has protected its status as first in the nation, and yeah, they'll start a war over that. It's not. They take it really seriously, to the point that in 1996, actually, Louisiana Republicans tried to leapfrog ahead of the calendar. And this is a tiny town in Louisiana called actually Iowa, Louisiana. And basically, Iowa threw a fit over this, even though it was a tiny, tiny town. It was like, no, we're not having this, and forced all the Republican candidates to boycott the Louisiana. So Iowa basically is keeping its status, and that's it. That we are not changing that. They're going to be first in the nation. And we are going to keep seeing people going back and forth in different districts and eating popcorn and eating corn dogs. And like, I don't know how these people don't put on 20 pounds. Like, I'm like, every candidate who goes to Iowa eats so much food. I don't know how they fit in their buses on their way out. So, as I said, there are many problems with caucuses. It's limited participation, and that's a problem. The rules are infernal, like nobody can follow the rules. And everybody gets confused about what happens next, which leads to fights and all kinds of recriminations and issues when outcomes are closed and bad feelings. It takes a while to settle everybody. And also, there are concerns about the ability of minority and lower income folks in terms of participating to caucuses because of the time commitment required by that, for that. So before I get to gerrymandering, any questions about the primaries and caucuses and all of that? Yes. They don't vote exactly. So they meet and they go from, so initially they form a group. Each supporters of each candidate forms a group at one point in the room. And then they start going around and trying to convince people to move to their group. So they can tell from the size of the groups which groups are not going anywhere and which groups have potential. So if you have like a group with like 5 people and a group with 150 people, clearly you go to the 5 people and you're like, okay, your candidate has no future. Let's talk to you about our candidate. So they do negotiations and they try to convince people to move to other groups until finally there is one prevailing group. Everybody ends up, or almost everybody, or the majority essentially becomes part of that group. So it's a continual rebuilding of groups, and the people who don't have support end up getting into other groups.
Oh, here, I just
No,
want to get the
the code-
questions
yes.
on the microphone. So here.
Oh, that's you. Yeah, so, yeah, I'm not understanding.
These are partisan caucuses, so it's
Okay.
only Republicans
Republican-
or only Democrats.
So
There
there's
is
two-
no cross, this is not for when it comes to the general, it's an election. The caucus is only for the primaries. Other questions about the primaries?
When I first started voting in ancient history, there was something called a blanket primary in some states. That meant that any registered voter could vote for anybody in any party. What happened to that? And does it still exist anywhere?
I think that's the equivalent of the open primary. I think it's just the same idea, but with a different term, because an open primary is you show up and you decide what party you want to vote right there and then, regardless of what your affiliation is.
This person in this party and this office in a different party.
So you would get 2 different ballots. So you could get,
Same ballot was for everybody, like a general election, just a primary.
I don't know. I'll look into that. I'll ask my
Okay,
friends who do work specifically on this, like the history of election systems in there. It looks it sounds complicated to me.
this is what- about that.
It,
Let's start. I believe the Supreme Court.
it,
And that, and based on what you said earlier, I can't accept that because the state has control.
I don't know what the basis would be for that determination, but it could be that it forces the 2 parties to select the same date, because if the candidates from both parties have to be on the same ballot for the primary, that means that both parties have to have their election on the same day and time, which is not necessary. Right? It's the party has to make that determination. But I'll look it up, and next time I'll have an answer.
Is what you're calling an open primary, the system in California?
In California now, they're doing a ranked system, I think, which is not quite the same. I'll get to the ranked system because it's very complicated. Nobody understands it. Unless you are in Major League Baseball. If you understand that, in terms of MVP stuff, how they select MVPs, then you might understand ranked voting because it's complicated.
Okay, and in 1976, it was Carter in Iowa, #1, and #2 was Birch Bayh.
Okay, that's what it
Kennedy
was.
wasn't in.
No, it was in 80, I think, that Kennedy was against Reagan, I think.
Perhaps.
But thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Who covers the expenses of
Um,
these elections?
The expenses come from the state because they are official elections. We cover the elections. So yes, we pay for that collectively. So one thing that complicates even more our election systems is the tradition of gerrymandering. The word gerrymandering is very old, and it comes from a elected official in Massachusetts way back in history, who actually was in charge of developing districts and figured out what the Constitution or the way that the Supreme Court has interpreted redistricting Well, actually, let me start before that. So the Constitution requires that every 10 years there's reapportionment. We have a census, and because people move from state to state and the population of locations changes over time, we do a census, and that's very, very important for people to fill out the census is this. If we have not good data on the census, our state can lose elected officials. So it can lose representation in Congress. So people become apprehensive about filling out the census for a variety of reasons. And the result is that we could lose a seat in Congress, which is a problem. So every 10 years, we reconfigure not only the House, the Senate is set because it's 2 senators per state, but also the state House and the state Senate in most places. So, and because in Reynolds v. Sims in 1964, the Supreme Court said that this districts need to have 2 things, geographic contiguity and basically be equal population size. So 1 person, 1 vote. Because what happened before that was that the states would create districts on the basis of counties. And in Illinois specifically, for example, they would downweight Chicago that has like 5 million people in favor of this downstate that has fewer people. In Reynolds v. Sims, the court said, no, that's not going to happen. We have to have districts with roughly equal number of representatives. And at the federal level now, I think it's like 650,000 people per representative, roughly. But geographic contiguity means that somehow all the district has to be connected. The result is little shenanigans like that. You may recognize this. I think it's from up here in Evanston. And as long as you find a little tiny corridor to connect these disparate things, you're all set. And what's been happening more recently is that they're using very powerful computer programs to maximize to not waste partisan votes, basically, to create districts that are exactly 52% Democrat or 52% Republican, a very, very reliably Democrat or Republican. And that has made both the state institutions and Congress very uncompetitive. So today in Congress, they're about out of all of the 435 representatives, about, I think it's like 36 seats that are considered competitive. Everything else, it's either a Democratic or a Republican seat. And by competitive, we mean 10 percentage points, within 10 percentage points difference. So there are seats, even in Congress. I mean, there are seats here, we know it, like Chicago seats, for example, there isn't even a Republican candidate in the seat because it's a waste of money, right? It's so strongly Democratic that the party doesn't challenge them. There are seats like that in Congress where the Democrats down, like in the South, there are places where the Democrats just don't run candidates because they don't have a chance at all, and it's a waste of money. So, which is a very big problem for democracy, the fact that you have elections where the candidate, once elected, is there forever. Because who's going to challenge them? There's no challenger. And when we have unified government at the state level, so that one party controls both institutions, the House and the Senate, or the Assembly and the Senate, and the governorship, you end up with redistricting maps a lot of the times that are basically consolidating their advantage. And we are seeing this here in Illinois. We are seeing this happening in Wisconsin and in Michigan. In Florida has happened where now they have an independent commission, but even the independent commission, there's shenanigan going on there. But there is a movement to create independent commissions and take the redistricting process out of the hands of elected officials, because the hope is that an independent commission made up of like jurists and geographers and academics would do a better job of creating fair districts that are more competitive. It's not going very far as a movement. But what's happening with gerrymandering is important because it also relates to the issue of the primaries. When you're creating a district that is solidly Democrat or solidly Republican, that means that the competition, you still have competition, but the competition is moved to the primary level. So it is within Republicans or within Democrats and the flanks of the party there that get to compete. And because in primaries, remember, it is the committed, very passionate, very extreme voters who tend to participate. What happens is that you have extreme candidates, especially today, because another big change in the American system since 2010 or so has been Citizens United. Citizens United was a case that the Supreme Court decided, where they decided that basically independent expenditures by corporations or super PACs that do not have a requirement to produce the names of their donors and who like gives them their money can basically advertise in support of candidates as long as these expenditures are not coordinated with the candidate. Well, the candidate watches TV, right? I mean, how uncoordinated is that? So the result has been that people who when the party had more control of the nomination process, of the primary process, the party would field more moderate candidates because they're thinking of the general election. They want people elected. They don't want their most extremists. But what's happening now is that extremists get elected in these districts, which then become, because they're solidly one or the other, they don't have an opponent in the general. So the minute that you win the primary, you have won the general election. It's just, even if nobody shows up at the general election, basically you've won the election. So we are seeing a shift, an ideological shift within institutions that is very, very visible. The American institutions, especially Congress, has become more and more extreme. The partisans have become more extreme. And gerrymandering in combination with the primary systems that is very partisan, and in combination with independent expenditures like Citizens United, have contributed to creating extremism among political elites. And these political elites, unfortunately, foment extremism in the people. They're the ones who make the people respond more extremely. And we are paying the price of all these, unfortunately, changes. So this is how basically we can think about gerrymandering. This is how you can do districting. If you have, this is different ways to split the districts in ways that one or the other wins. You could have, this is basically how many? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 by 5, right? This is the districts that you have. You could have 40% red districts and 60% blue districts. Or you could end up with, 5 blue districts and 0 red districts. So, or you could have swap it in a way that it's 3 red districts and 2 blue districts. So the same combination of people, if you have like 50 precincts where the majority of the people are blue and the minority of the people are red, you can cut the districts in such a way that the majority of the representatives are blue or the majority of the representatives are red, depending on who's in control and who's making these districts. Sorry. So this is an illustration of how gerrymandering works. You can do it fairly, or you can like create little salamander districts. So any more questions about gerrymandering or about the primaries and about the system?
There's several questions from online.
Yep.
So first question, would we have more fair representation if we went by the popular vote to declare winners?
For the
I think they're
The-
talking about the,
presidential election?
yeah.
Yes, we would have a true democratic representation if we ditched the electoral college and we actually took the outcome of the election at face value, like the actual percentage. Because what we are seeing over the past 2 decades is that even though persistently the majority of the voters in presidential elections vote for Democratic candidates, because of the electoral college, there are cases where the delegates are split in such a way and the votes are in such states that Republicans win the presidency. The only time where you have a Republican win both the electoral college and the popular vote was Bush in 2004. But otherwise, Trump in 2016 did not win the popular vote. And neither did, of course, we know what happened in 2000. That was a fun election too, with the hanging chads and the pregnant, whatever, I don't remember what they were called.
Okay, so other countries levy fines if you don't vote. Levy fines so you don't vote. Could America and should America do this to encourage everyone to vote?
So in the US, we are interpreting voting as a right, not as an obligation. It's not a civic obligation, a legal obligation. It's a right. So you, in a liberal democracy, at least according to the American tradition, it's up to you if you want to participate politically. Chasing after people, even in places where you're obligated to vote, it rarely works any better. I am from Greece. I am obligated to vote. I have voted once because Greece makes it incredibly difficult to vote from here. It was only one time in my adult life that I actually was in Greece during an election and I actually was able to vote. To impose the penalties, it's also very, very costly. So what we are seeing across Europe, even in places where there is the obligation to vote and there are like penalties, non-participation has increased significantly, and there's very little to do to enforce. Another thing is the fact that you force people to participate doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to participate meaningfully. In Europe, for example, you can submit a blank vote. So vote for no one. It's problematic too because if people are not engaged in the system and they're just forced to participate. They can go to the voting booth and do any, mini, miny, mo. And what comes out, maybe you vote for, I don't know, the Nazi candidate, because you have no idea who it is, or you pick random criteria like, oh, I like that name, or it's the third, I'll pick the third one on the list. Like, that doesn't make it any better or more democratic, just more. So the big challenge is how to make people more civically engaged rather than just voters. How to make people participate in the political system in meaningful ways so that our elites are accountable. And that's the key problem that we have, is that people do not follow politics, don't understand the system, and as a result, we don't have the level of accountability in the system that we would like to have. People take liberties with our institutions that they shouldn't have, because they expect that we are not going to punish them because we are otherwise engaged.
There is a question about ranked voting, but you said you were going to answer
I
that.
will get there.
Okay. Why do we still give wealthy landowners in Wyoming, population 500,000, the same number of senators as the entire state of California, over 39 million? How can this be fair representation?
Very good question. The Senate is a minoritarian institution, and for a lot of people, we should not have the Senate in its form. We should abolish the Senate as an institution, because what it does is, in fact, it weighs more the political power of very small states, which also tend to be very conservative states. So if you are a conservative, that's good news for you in the sense that you get extra power than really you should have in the system, given the people who support the types of policies that you like. If you are a liberal, it is a terrible situation, because you see your policies not being supported to the degree that the population supports them. And what's interesting, if you look at public opinion data, what people support, the US is a slightly center-right country. It's a very centrist country that actually it likes a lot as a population. On average, they like a lot of the same things that Europeans like. But we don't have the same kinds of European goodies because our institutions give a lot of power to actors who have veto, like in the Senate, or interest groups, or courts that can block all kinds of things that tend to be liked by people on the left. For example, the whole debate over the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, that went to court a couple of times. There were so many calls for repeal. Those were not based on what the average public opinion member wanted. This was to promote the desires of specific groups, subgroups within the population that didn't like it for a variety of reasons. Okay, I mean, we'll cover where we cover, right? So one of the questions was about the presidential debates and where does that come from? The first presidential debate was actually between JFK and Nixon, which was a disaster for Nixon. Nixon didn't play well on TV. He was sweating a lot. He was like cleaning his forehead a lot, and he looked very shady because of that. On TV, the audiences hated him, even though when they did actually a test where they compared people who listened to him on radio versus people who watched the debates on TV, and it was night and day. He came out of the radio as stately and very presidential and really good, and then anybody who saw him on TV was like, oh my God, who is this? So the next debate, neither Johnson, LBJ was like, I'm not getting on TV, forget about it. And then Nixon again, after the first experience, was like, no TV for me, thank you. He had a few additional problems in 72, so that may have contributed to his version of TV. And it was again Carter who participated in a debate against Ford in 1976. In 1987, we developed the Commission on Presidential Debate, which was a bipartisan organization set up to organize and decide or where and how and who's going to present the debates and all of that. And it has sponsored all debates since 1988. And the funding for this comes from private donors. Now we don't know if we're going to have debates. I could not tell you. So for the Democratic primaries, there is no debates because there's one candidate. He could come on TV and talk to us for an hour, but what's the point? With the primaries of the Republican Party, Trump didn't show up. So it was basically, everybody was saying, well, that the guy who is going to win the primaries is not there. So what's the point of listening to these other people that nobody has heard of, like Hutchinson? Who is that? Or the other guy who was Nebraska governor, or like, people felt that it was not really helpful, useful. In last year, in February, the GOP said that they're not going to participate in the presidential debates claiming media bias. So I don't know. There is a schedule for the debates. If you go online to the CPD website, they'll tell you like September 16 is the first debate and the other debate and the vice presidential debate. It's their wishful thinking because I don't know, honestly. I don't see why Biden would show up in a debate because it would validate Trump in a sense. He would be saying that, yeah, I consider him a worthy opponent, and have what kind of a debate would that be where it would be like, yeah, you're under an indictment and you were impeached, and then, yeah, you're being impeached now. Like, it would be a circus. So I don't see the debates happening. I don't think that they would benefit. In a normal election, any other type of election, you expect to learn something about elected officials, like candidates' positions on issues from the debates. In this case, the fear is that it's going to be like, yeah, a comedy show. So I would not hold these dates. If something else comes up that you need to do, I would not hold these dates. Ranked choice voting. Okay. So there are several types of ranked voting methods that states and cities are using. The two key ones are the instant runoff, not our runoff, voting, and the single transferable vote. So far, 2 states, Maine and Alaska, have used the ranked choice votings. And many cities, including Evanston, I believe, are using ranked choice. So how does this work? So basically, you get a ballot that looks kind of like this, and you put down who's your first choice, who's your second choice, who's your third choice, and who's your fourth choice. So in theory, what happens is if your first choice, let's say this is the Republican primary, and your first choice is who was the guy who got like less than 10 votes, like the bottom of the least vote guy, Asa Hutchinson. Since he is the lowest vote getter, the people who voted for him first their vote is then allocated to their second choice. So my second choice was, let's say, Nikki Haley. So then my vote would go to Nikki Haley. And there would be continued reallocation going up the ladder until one candidate got at least 50% of the overall votes. Does that make sense? Okay. This is how complicated this is. So the alternative vote, candidates with fewest first preference votes are eliminated successively, and their votes go to the next choice until one candidate has a majority. This is what's happening in Alaska and in Maine, and Australia uses this. Then there's 2 rounds. We do this, I think, with mayoral candidates. So candidates who are not in the first or second place in total votes are eliminated in the first round, and then they go to the second round. We see, I think that's how we do mayoral. Isn't that, yes, this is how we did the mayoral candidates in Chicago this year, where we had a second round because Lori Lightfoot was eliminated in the first, and then we had the 2 candidates go to the second round, in a sense. Georgia and Louisiana have this, and the French presidential elections are like this. There is a 2-round majority plurality system. There is also a preferential block vote, which is used in Utah, of all places. There is a single transferable vote, which is used in Massachusetts, Michigan, and California, in Ireland and Malta. And then there is also the BARDA count, which is what Major League Baseball most valuable player system is. So candidates with the highest rankings as elected successively until all seats are filled, because there's like a multiple seats that are being filled, not a majoritarian system. So depending on where you are, you may be dealing with one of these different things. But the idea basically is that either you have actual multiple rounds of elections, or your second and third votes are treated as the second or the third round of elections. But it's a single ballot. Of course, this becomes very complicated, and people get surprised by the outcomes because you have no way of like telling the way that we do polling, for example. Like, it's one thing to say, who did you vote for in the exit poll? And it's another thing to say, who was your first, second, and third choice? So you ask people, who do you vote for? And the result comes out from the poll as, oh, such and such is in the lead. And then the election outcome, because of the complicated ranked vote system, is something different. And it's like, what happened? Wait a minute. How do we get there? And then to explain how we got there is complicated. And then people are like, no, this is fraud. This is, fake news. That's not what happened. So we're going to see how it works in Alaska and Maine. It is a good system not to waste people's votes. So it allows you to get out of the 2-party system in the sense of like, okay, I don't like them, but I can vote the Green Party or the Libertarian Party first, but at least I know that my vote is not completely wasted. Because if you vote today for the Libertarian Party or for JFK, or not JFK, RFK Jr., your vote is wasted, right? It's as good as staying at home. What's the point? Whereas if you have multiple candidates, then at least you are able to say, okay, my second best vote after RFK Jr. is Trump or is Biden or is whoever. And that way, at least your vote is not completely wasted. Any questions about ranked choice voting? We don't have it here. We have it in Evanston, not statewide. So specific towns have adopted it. And And Chicago has it for the mayoral the two-round majority runoff for the mayoral election, but not as a state. We don't have ranked choice voting. We'll see how it performs. These are sort of the test states. People are trying to push for it as a way to sort of create more enthusiasm, because people are getting tired of like, okay, I'm always have to pick one or the other. Is it, I'm like, my vote is wasted. They're also thinking that instead of having primaries, that's another possibility, is like nix the primaries altogether and everyone shows up on the ballot in November. So we don't waste money for primaries. We don't waste time for primaries. And everybody has a choice. And all the people who would be on the primary ballot for the Democrats, the Republicans, the Libertarians are in one big pile. And then we use this system to sort out who's the winner. How happy we will be if we do that, I do not know. But it is a possibility. It's a less expensive proposition than what we are paying now for elections. Presidential elections this year are going to be above $2 billion. Like, we're getting to a point where, is this a good way of using money? Because we are spending insane amounts of money on election and election campaigning. So a lot of political scientists are saying maybe there is a better way to do this so that we don't spend this much on campaigns, because we have problems and campaign advertising doesn't solve problems. So we'll see.
Okay, yeah, why don't we just maybe hold off on the rest of the questions so Alexandra can kind of finish her last several points.
So I can just stop here basically and take on some more questions so that I don't get onto a completely different topic, which is, how do we make decisions, which is a very different.
And you know what? I think that, well, we know that you're going to come back sometimes in the next few months, which we'll talk about. And we'll make sure everybody knows. So maybe we'll make sure that that's more of a focus of the next
Absolutely.
session, so we can get a chance to focus on the psychology behind decision making. So let's take a couple questions here before we wrap up.
In the example you used, where my first candidate, Hutchinson, came out last, but then you applied my votes to my second, Nikki Haley. If she didn't get a majority, then my votes go to the third guy, my third
If
choice?
she was eliminated because she was like fourth in the overall count, yes, your votes would go to the one who was your third choice.
And on to the
And
fourth,
then,
et cetera.
yeah. So basically, until somebody had enough to go past the post of 50+1. And your vote could end up there in that bucket, or could go with the second candidate, depending on the order in which you had them on your ballot. But at least the idea is that you contributed more than a completely wasted.
In a ranked voting system, how do you get your name on the ballot? Write in, or do you have to apply to be included?
I think that I don't know if they allow write-ins. I think they would, because there's nothing that prevents you from writing it in. And then if enough people write that name in, it moves up. Or if you wrote yourself in then as a first choice, and then your second choice is Trump, then your first choice would be eliminated and your vote would go to Trump, right? In the first round, you had all the candidates, which was people who had registered to run for the election. And I'm sure that there were also, you had the option of write-in as well. And then the top two vote getters, unless in the first round there was a possibility that in the first round, one candidate would have gotten 50 plus one and would have been elected in the first round. But if that doesn't happen, then you go, the two top vote getters go to the second round.
So is there concern in states with ranked voting on sort of election, you know, the truth in the election? And I think you mentioned that it's harder to kind of untangle the process. And so is that a concern, just like voter machines and things like that?
It's a perception issue, not a systems issue. Like the system is in place. We know what the rules are, and you know the mathematicians and statisticians who actually tally the votes based on the system know how to do it right. But from the perception of the average voter, because of the complexity, it is very easy to create conspiracy theories that say, well, there was something shady. I don't believe that, you know, this is really the second person was X rather than Y. And that's very bizarre to me because, you know, I know my friend of a friend of my cousin's third cousin, you know, that kind of thing.
Okay, well, this was just a really great presentation. We learned so much and broke down so many topics that I know we're kind of familiar with, but may not feel that confident talking about. So as you know, we're going to have the privilege of working with Alexandra during the course of this year and this election year. So if there are other topics that you would like to hear more about, please let us know, because we are working on developing our future programming. For example, Alexandra has a lot of experience with the psychology behind decision making, and that's something we'll talk about the next program. But please let us know, either myself or Ashley or Alexandra, and let us know what you'd want to hear more about. But we will definitely be continuing this conversation through the course of 2024 so that we can keep everybody. The whole point, one of the points you made was about getting and keeping people actively engaged in the election process. So that's what we want to do here. So thank you, everyone.
You're very welcome.